Welcome to the second part of this three-part webinar on redundancy. If you've seen the first part, you will now be aware of the law behind redundancy and be familiar with key elements such as pooling and scoring your employees. This section, we're going to focus mainly on the consultation meetings that you would need to go through with your employees if you're holding a redundancy process. The first thing you're going to want to do when you've got to this stage is hold an initial meeting with your employees and warn them of the situation that is in place. You should meet with them and explain the situation that is facing your organisation, what's happened, why are you actually in a redundancy situation, the jobs that are at risk of being made redundant, and the reasons for this. You should also explain any alternatives to redundancy that are being considered. I'm actually going to cover those in the third chapter of this webinar. It's really, really important when consulting with your employees that you must have an open mind and be capable of influence on the matter that you're consulting about. This is something that I repeatedly mention to my clients. The consultation must be meaningful. You must not say anything during it which gives any form of insinuation or any sort of flicker in the employee's mind that an outcome is predetermined. It's really, really important. I think generally repeating to yourself, no final decision has been made, should feature frequently throughout letters, throughout meetings, probably even in your sleep as you're going through this process. It's just that important. Without that, if there is any form of indication that it's the outcome is predetermined, it's almost certainly going to be deemed a sham consultation, and the dismissal is much more likely to be deemed procedurally unfair. If you're considering volunteers for redundancy, this is a good time to make that offer. I will also talk about voluntary redundancy a little bit later as well. Now, on to our next slide. So you'll see my recommendation after you've had this meeting is that you send out a letter. You should send out a letter to all of those employees confirming that the meeting took place, confirming what you said to them in that meeting, and confirming the information that you generally relayed to them. Now, there are two scenarios here. You'll see from the earlier flowchart and what I'm going to talk about now that there's a particular step, obviously, when you need to carry out your scoring, which we talked about in the first chapter of this webinar. If you haven't already carried out your scoring process, this is when you'll want to do it. You will just need to inform in this first letter your employees that you'll be in touch further in due course to invite them to individual consultation meetings, and then you carry out your scoring and write to those affected to invite them to those meetings. Now, however, if you are like 99% of most employers who, as soon as they're aware that there is a redundancy situation at foot, they will race to carry out their scoring procedure to see who's going to be at risk, which ones of their employees are likely to go, and then sometimes also enthusiastically race to see how that criteria can be tweaked so that particular employees are the ones at risk. Then you can obviously skip the scoring step because you've already done it, and you will invite them to a first meeting at this stage. So you will hold your initial meeting, put them at risk, and then you'll invite them to their first consultations at this stage. The thing I should actually mention about scoring, which I haven't mentioned before, is that scoring isn't actually always necessary. It's not going to cover every single redundancy situation that there is. So if, for example, you have a situation where the overall headcount of an entire department needs to be decreased, so it's that sort of going from 20 employees down to 5 employees that I mentioned initially, if some of those roles obviously are still going to remain, you will probably need to carry out a scoring process just to identify exactly who it is that's going to be going or to be putting at risk. Falling into my own traps there. If, however, you are facing closure of a business, so an entire department is going to go, there's going to be no employees retained, everybody's going to be at risk, you don't need to go through the scoring process. Second letter, so you've dealt with all of that, you've carried out your scoring, you've sent out your initial letter. If you haven't, if you have just carried out your scoring now, apologies, the second letter should then be sent after you've carried out that scoring to those who have, as a result of the scoring, been identified at risk of redundancy. Now, this letter should advise them of their provisional selection. It should invite them to an individual consultation meeting. It should repeat the reasons for that proposed redundancy. It's something that we recommend that you repeat at every stage along the process. And where relevant, if you have done scoring, you need to set out those individual scores against the selection criteria so that they're clear of what's been happening. What the letter we would also recommend is the letter also advises them of their right to be accompanied to that meeting. Now, they don't actually have an express right to be accompanied in the same way as they would to a disciplinary or a grievance meeting. As I said, the ACAS code doesn't apply. However, it is best practice and it's something that we would generally speaking advise. It really does help to have let them have somebody else. As I say, it can be quite a stressful or upsetting process. So generally speaking, we'd say it's safest, it's best practice if you allow them to be accompanied by a trade union representative or a colleague, as you wish. The letter should finally make clear that no final decision has been made and that a consultation process has made sense. I'm going to repeat this throughout the course of this chapter, just so that it's entirely clear. That's your letter inviting them in. So the only other thing, you've obviously may well have a selection of people who are not going to be invited because the selection criteria has deemed that they are not at risk. So you will need to deal with those. What we would suggest is that you write to those individuals, let them know that these were their scores, that they have not provisionally at the time being been put at risk. However, you do need to make sure that those employees are aware that this is all subject to further consultation. It might be that as you go through the consultation process, scores are adjusted. Some of those people who are initially not at risk will be brought back into the process. So just be a little bit careful that you manage their expectations at this particular time. Moving on to the next slide then, we will cover the first consultation meeting itself. So you've sent the letter, you've got them into the meeting, what are you going to talk to them about? This first meeting will typically cover the following things. So firstly, an overview of the reasons for the proposed redundancies, confirmation of why that particular employee has been selected, where appropriate, where you've done scoring, disclosure of their scores in particular, explaining how they're arrived at and why you gave them particular levels of scoring that they did. You want to give the employee a basis to comment on many things actually, so the basis for the selection itself, their actual inclusion in any pool or whether the pool was appropriate or not, and of course the use of the particular selection criteria that you have used. Now you don't have to show them everybody else's scores, but you may wish to consider giving them an anonymised breakdown of the other scores, just so that they can actually review themselves against everybody else who's in the pool, and then give them a slightly better chance of actually being able to challenge those scores. Without that, obviously they're going in blind, they don't know where they sit against everybody else, so that's something that you may well want to consider, and certainly is something that employees may well ask you for. If you are doing this, the one thing we'd say is just obviously bear in mind that if there's any risk of any sensitive personal data being disclosed, that you need to ensure that this is removed so that you are being careful not to breach any data protection obligations. An example of this really is if you, for example, if you've got a team of 10 or 20, if there's one individual who has been off sick for a couple of weeks, maybe they had an operation, they were off sick, they were out for a few weeks as a result, everybody knows about that and nobody else has been off sick, it may well be quite easy to identify them from your scoring if they're the only person that's been marked down for attendance. So do consider those kind of things if you're going, even if you're going to be anonymising the names. It may well be that you need to remove particular criteria altogether. The next thing that we'd suggest that you do is or discuss with them is give them an opportunity to put forward any suggestions that they may have for ways that they can avoid their redundancy. Now this is really so important. This is what it's all about. This is what your consultation needs to be focusing on. So has the employee got any suggestions they want to make? The final thing is consideration of any alternative employment positions that may exist. If you've got any vacancies within your organisation at the moment, you really must make sure that your employees are aware of those, that they're given the opportunity to apply if appropriate. It's a very important step, and I will be dealing with that in more detail in the third part of this seminar. At this stage, if you want to, you can open up any vacancies that you may have. You don't have to at this stage, but especially in a restructure sort of situation, it's quite common that there may be some new roles that have been created. You can open them up at this point. You can issue employees with job descriptions, key terms, that sort of thing, in order them to fully establish whether they want to apply, whether any roles are going to be deemed suitable or not. and you can, if you wish, run the interview process alongside the consultation process that's taking place. Sometimes it's quite a good idea. One thing I always say in any kind of meetings that you have with your employees, whether it's redundancy process, if it's your disciplinary grievances, anything else along those lines, do please take good notes of the meeting. It's so important to get yourself a really good paper trail as you go through, especially if you end up in a tribunal situation. You're going to want to be able to demonstrate that you've talked through all of these steps with your employees and you've given them every chance to be able to put forward any arguments they may have against their selection and everything else. On to the next slide then. We're going to be thinking about consideration of what took place in the meeting. So you conclude your meeting, you adjourn, the employee goes off. You're going to then want to go away and think about what it is that you discussed with that employee, what suggestions they come up with, if they came up with anything that may actually mean that any scoring that you've put into place needs to be amended. And if necessary, adjust that scoring accordingly. If changes are made to the scores, as I mentioned earlier, the pool may then need to be reshuffled. It may be that some employees will be brought back into the pool and other employees are taken out. So there is a reasonable amount of work that may need to be done then, depending obviously on the feedback that you get from your first consultation meeting. After this, after you've had time to consider what's happening and made any adjustments, you need to then send a next letter. We love a letter in a redundancy process. It's one of those parts of documentation that we'd like to keep nice and clear for the purposes of defending any claim if you ever end up in the unfortunate position that you have one. So the next letter needs to confirm a few things. So firstly, you're going to reconfirm those reasons that you've got for redundancy. It's really confirming the fact that statutory reason does exist and there is a genuine redundancy situation in place, and importantly that your employees are fully averse with that and they know the reasons for it. So they're under no shadow of doubt that there could be any dodgy goings on. Secondly, your letter's going to want to confirm what was discussed in the consultation meeting. You can just send them a copy of the minutes if you want, but otherwise you can just give them a reasonable short breakdown of what you discussed. You'll want to invite them at that stage to a further consultation meeting. Advise them again that they can be accompanied to that meeting and make it clear that no final decision has yet been made. Yes, as I say, throughout. Going on to the next slide then, you'll see we'll return to our trusty flow chart. You'll see that we're now making good progress. We've ticked off a lot more boxes and we're working our way around that quite nicely. I'll breathe a sigh of relief. We are getting there. The next slide then will take me into your second consultation meeting. Now, during this meeting, it's reasonably similar to the last one, but what you're going to want to do, you will repeat the explanations given in the earlier meeting about the reasons for redundancies, still making that clear. Answer any questions they may have or give any replies to any suggestions that were raised at the first consultation meeting. That's really what this meeting is all about. It's about giving them feedback about what they raised at the last meeting and giving them any sort of solutions if their scoring has been changed, if their scoring hasn't been changed as a result of what they said. If they had some wonderful light bulb moment about how they can save the company and it's turned out that's unfortunately not going to happen. That's the kind of stuff you're going to be wanting to reply to. And then you're going to give them the opportunity to raise anything else. Have they had any more ideas of how to save the company and or to save their position since the last meeting? Take those on board. Make notes as before. If there are any further points that need consideration, at this stage you're going to need to adjourn the meeting. You're going to go away, you're going to have to consider it as before, you'll maybe make some more adjustments to the selection criteria as is appropriate. Send a further letter, hold a further consultation meeting to discuss the organisation's responses to those points. And then you kind of repeat as necessary. Now, I don't mean repeat as necessary so that the employee can drag this on for months and months and years if it's unnecessary to do so. However, you do need to just think about what is going to be reasonable. What are the employees raising? What are the points? Is there any merit to the points they are raising? Eventually, you can draw a line under the process. But do bear in mind what it is that they're saying and whether it really is actually something that you should be giving some consideration to. A third meeting is generally sufficient for most cases. As I say though, it's how long is a piece of string. Sometimes these things will actually need a little bit more time. When you reach a point that you're ready to conclude the consultation process, you're going to need to confirm that unfortunately the employee's position is redundant, and then you're going to need to go through any redundancy package with them. You will also need to inform them of their right to appeal. So our next slide, you'll see that we then need to send a dismissal letter. The dismissal letter really should be sent out promptly after the first consultation meeting. In this letter, you're going to be confirming the decision that has been taken to dismiss the employee by reason of redundancy. You're going to want to notify them of the right to appeal and set out the time frame for that. Obviously refer to any redundancy policy that you may have which may set out a particular time frame, or if you don't have one, just what's reasonable, maybe 5 or 10 days in order to submit their appeal. And you will also want to confirm various key points to them as you would in any kind of dismissal letter. So whether they're expected to work their notice period, if they'll be put on garden leave, if they'll be paid in lieu of their notice. Likewise, you will want to probably set out at this stage the exact calculation of any redundancy pay that they're going to get and cover things such as holiday, those sorts of general provisions. The reason I say that this should be sent out quite quickly, or at least promptly after the first final consultation meeting, is that a lot of contracts of employment will specify that notice is not effective until it's actually in writing. So even if you've confirmed orally to your employee that that you are wishing to serve their notice and they're going to be made redundant, until you've actually put that in writing, sometimes it won't actually be effective. So do try and do that quite promptly. Give certainty to the employees as well, which is always nice. On the next slide, we see that appeals are something that is important to make sure that you've had a fair redundancy process. If an employee submits an appeal, you're going to want to send them a letter acknowledging that appeal. You're going to want to invite them to an appeal meeting. You're going to want to arrange someone more different. I mean, it typically tends to be someone more senior than the people who've been hearing the initial consultation meetings, and that person will then hold that meeting. If you don't have anyone more senior in your organisation, because you have quite a small organisation, then at least make it somebody else, but preferably somebody who's at least on the same level as the individual who heard the initial meetings. During that meeting, you're going to want to listen to what they've got to say. Why have they raised their points to appeal? And it's really almost like a rerun of some of the early meetings. So you're going to listen to them, let them have their feedback, make a good note of their points, adjourn the meeting, go away, have a think about it, do any changes that need to be made. Has anything changed the fact that you've dismissed them? Do they need to actually be reinstated? If that's the case, obviously you will need to reinstate them. If it's not, you'll just need to send them a letter at that stage confirming that the outcome of the appeal has not changed the situation, that their position is redundant and was still redundant from the date when you initially sent them that notification. Going back then on the next slide to our flowchart, you will see that we've pretty much finished everything. We've gone through all of the various different stages. We've now reached the end of the sort of standard redundancy process that I set out at the beginning. There are a few little gaps that I do actually need to fill in for this, which is what I'm going to cover in the next slide. And that is really concluding the end of the second part of this webinar. In the third part, I'll be looking at various ancillary matters. So, for example, the suitable alternative employment, what's deemed as suitable, and those sorts of questions. And also looking at things such as payments on redundancy and the other sorts of things that may cause you a few headaches along the way. Thank you.